Welcome to this new episode of the Danube Institute podcast. My name is Callum Nicholson. I'm Director of Research here at the Danube Institute. And today we have two guests with us. We have Gavin Haynes, who's a visiting fellow here and a journalist from the UK. And we have visiting fellow Professor Doug Stokes, who's a Professor of International Relations at Exeter. And he's a Senior Advisor and Fellow at the Legatum and the Danube Institutes. And he's the author of the 2023 book, I believe, Against Decolonization, the Campus Culture Wars and the Decline of the West, which was described as, or nominated rather, as the Book of the Year in 2023 by the Times Literary Supplement. So we're here today and we're going to talk about the state of UK politics, move on to geopolitics. I want to ask you about your new book, Doug. But first of all, really, for both of you, it's clearly an interesting time in British politics right now. We've got a Tory leadership race. I think the second round is happening today. And also we've got Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party, also Prime Minister, off to quite a bad start, it seems, in his first few months. And I'm wondering, first of all, what your general thoughts are on the state of British politics. Gavin.
Lost, I think, is the state of play, but it's a loss that many people predicted before the election, that we would just get into this funk, that Starmer would lose the thread pretty quickly. He has done an impressive job of that, and that the Tories would be just in the wilderness and sagging, and all of those things have rather come to pass, and it appears that the Tory leadership election is just going to be increasingly it's going to be a runoff between Cleverly and Jenrick, or maybe Badenoch, as we record this. And none of those people seem to be made of the metal that would bring the ideas that we would need. And it seems like the Tory parliamentary party is extremely wet. Sunak seems to have completely disappeared from the frame. Didn't have anything to say about the riots of a couple of months back. And there is no politics here. It's just sort of sag and drift.
Doug?
Yeah, I think I would agree with most of that. All of it, in fact. I think it is very saggy. I think that, so the Starmer government gets in, obviously it doesn't get off to a great start. You have the riots, and then the perception and the reality of two-tier policing in the UK. I think Starmer is completely lost amongst the working class, and I think that's been a broader crisis of the Labour Party for a very long time, in terms of how it marries up its historical industrial working class roots and the Labour movement with the more intersectional type activism and activists that you have in the Labour Party. And I think that tension will only grow and grow and grow. On the Tory side, you've had 14 years, and for me as an academic in the UK, one bright spark or one oasis in this desert of 14 years of alleged Conservative rule was the academic freedom legislation, and I worked with that with a handful of other academics. And so one of the first moves that they do when Labour gets in is they repeal it, or they're seeking to repeal it. So that gives you an indication of travel on the part of the Labour Party. It's kind of anti-freedom, doesn't know what it wants, doesn't know what it wants to do. There's a kind of born-to-rule attitude, I think, amongst the Labour Party leadership. Whenever Starmer gets a question, puts him slightly on the back foot, he kind of comes back almost morally flabbergasted about it. But I think really both the Tories and the Labour Party suffer from a broader technocratic malaise that we have in Western politics. I think many of the answers that we need are rooted not just in domestic politics, but also in terms of supranational politics and essentially the structure of the international system and the kind of legacy institutions that we see. Think, for example, about how much the ECHR animates politics in the UK. We can't stop the boat because of the ECHR. So I think there are much deeper discussions that need to be had, not just in the UK, but in Western politics in general, about how we reboot the supranational and international architectures that we have to deal with growing problems, whether that's from climate change to mass migration to interstate conflict. We almost need a new sort of Yalta conference, I think, but we don't have the international leadership for that. So that would be my position on that.
It does seem interesting that a lot of the structures that came into place following World War II, and you mentioned Yalta, for instance, a lot of these structures seem to have almost had a human lifespan, 80 years now. Next year is the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. And it's interesting, the Romans had a word, which I will mispronounce, it's the cyclium or the cyclium, the idea of the course of human memory, 80, 85 years. And it really feels that that era is coming to an end in many ways. But you say that the technocratic consensus you see across both parties, I suppose that would be a manifestation or a result of the last 80 years. And it seems to me the politics today is people who want to just continue on that frame of reference, and people who are saying that entire frame of reference is wrong, which I suppose gets to the idea that what is the left and right anymore? Because it seems to me that the mainstream left and mainstream right seem to really just be about the status quo, perpetuating this sort of neoliberal technocratic worldview. I'm just wondering what you think of, given that the state of the Labour Party being an example of this, and it sounds like the leaders in the Tory campaign are also examples of this. What's the solution?
Well, there are many different solutions. I mean, but there are. I don't know about bright spots, but I look at like someone like Pierre Poilievre in Canada, who is a man who seems to have a plan for the right, and he is an incredible political communicator. Whenever he puts out a piece of information, it sparkles with a deep internal logic. You could characterize him as a reheated Thatcherite, but there is a backbone, there is a kind of fortitude there, and indeed when he's dealing with hecklers or questions, he's a principled figure. I mean, malaise maybe is sort of another angle of that, but there is a world in which there is a right that actually has something. That is not the right in Britain today. The right in Britain today, or the sort of Tory party right of it, is just sort of fudge, and let's see if we can, James Cleverly our way to some kind of like, can't we all get on, guys, and put a few bungs here and raise the tax rate by 1%. That is the sort of failed old consensus. And the problem is that this generation of politicians has been raised within that consensus, and they've never really had the intellectual curiosity to operate outside of that.
Can I ask actually I said, what's the solution? I suppose actually what I meant is, what's the problem? Because if you look at a lot of these people, Rishi Sunak was a good example of this, that people often said he operated like a manager, not a political leader. He didn't seem to have much political sense, it seemed. And I wonder, is it that people are lacking an idea of how to fix things, or are they simply lacking the courage to go against what are orthodoxies at polite dinner parties?
Oh, they're very much lacking that, yeah.
But is it both?
Well, it is a bit of both. I mean, you look at the Reform Party and how that is coming together in the UK now, and in many ways, Reform is reheated Thatcherism, and sort of boomer con layer to British society is not necessarily something new, but there is perhaps a kind of a synthesis position where the fact that Farage is this sort of scapegoat figure who has taken all of the hate of the internal establishment upon him could be a birthing point for something new. There's a sense like you have to be outside of the tent first, populism, if you will, in order to overcome this institutional inertia.
Yeah, I agree with that too. I think that perhaps the Tory party, I think it's super indulgent on the part of the Conservative Party to have these endless leadership contests, number one. I think the British public is sick of it. And I think perhaps a better idea would have been to have a caretaker leader of the Tory party and give it a couple of years and try and work out what it's all about. For me, I think that the big crisis in British politics, which also speaks to a broader crisis in the international system, is the irrelevance of liberalism now, or liberalism as it manifests itself in politics. I think much of what the dispensation that we had rested on institutional architectures internationally that are now under deep flux, not least through forms of developing multipolarity, an exhaustion on the part of the American state to bear the international costs of systemic maintenance, the cost-benefit analysis that many states are making in relation to supranational forms of governance. Take, for example, Brexit. I mean, that was ultimately about a cost-benefit analysis on the part of the British people about the costs of being in the EU versus the benefits. And each state as a nation state has to have that dialogue with itself. So I'd say that the crisis in British politics is interconnected with this broader international crisis of liberalism in terms of what the nation state is about, the role of sovereignty and a democratic social contract between the people and those they elect. And if we look at many of the deep discussions or the crises in British politics, it does come down to the way in which the state can act and discharge the democratic mandate of the British people, whether that's through forms of quangocracies and quangos and civil service inertia in terms of resisting reform agendas, perhaps in small cases or many cases ideologically opposed, but also just in terms of bureaucratic inertia and path dependency and feathering your own nest. And that's on the domestic level before you even get to the international level. I mean, again, I go back to the point, the small boat crisis, that's rooted in a deeper legalistic international regime of which Starmer is and that Labour dispensation, classic example of this, this kind of international human rights jurisprudence takes precedence over sovereignty. So I think many of the debates you're seeing throughout European politics and politics in the Anglophone West as well, more generally do relate to questions around sovereignty and how you restore the democratic social contract between the people and their elected representatives. You simply cannot keep having people putting their vote on a ballot paper and then politicians then take that vote and do the opposite with it. And the worst example of this was Boris Johnson. So, I mean, regardless of where you stand on immigration in the UK, Brexit wasn't a rejection or a xenophobic rejection of immigration per se. It was about essentially saying we need to slow this down and work out what we want and look at the impact this is having on communities, the nation state, social services, educational services, etc. Right? And that's a fair call. And Boris Johnson did the complete opposite of that. He pumped the gas on immigration. So I think that was the ultimate betrayal, really. So I think a lot of this does come down to the relationship between the nation state and any future Tory party or centre right has to do it through. I think Jenrick's said this too. This kind of a great reform bill. You cannot keep having governments in power that sit within a constitutional framework, largely bequeathed from the Blair government, whether that's the Equality Act, which is the root cause of most of what we call wokery across British institutions. It is related to a deeper constitutional framework bequeathed by the Blair government, the Supreme Court, the Human Rights Act, the Equality Act, the Public Sector Equality Duty. All these things that Conservatives bemoan and endlessly wail about are rooted in that constitutional dispensation. And when you constitutionalise fundamentally political questions, you neuter them and take them out of political contestation and democratic control. You institutionalise and therefore you settle these things. And that is the great democratic betrayal. So whoever wins in the Tory party has to have a cognizance of that and has to essentially go back to the British people and frame it in terms of democratic renewal. It's about taking back control. And that's what the British people want. And it's fair.
I've been feeling for a while that when we look at the culture, this distinction between the letter of something and the spirit of it. And I feel increasingly we live in a very sort of lettered culture that's sort of spiritless. And I don't mean this in a religious sense necessarily. It's more that when I see people make arguments about Brexit, the counter-arguments against things like Brexit were always very evidence-based, sort of almost technocratic rebuttals to particular points. But I often felt the impulse for Brexit was more about a general ethos, a general spirit of things, a general impulse, I suppose, which I think as time has passed looks more and more correct to me. And I'm wondering, this gets to a sort of a deeper problem or a deeper point, that with everything that's happening in the culture, there's many, many different problems. There's the cost of living, there's immigration, there's all these different problems. And I'm wondering, can we say there's such thing as a fundamental problem? What is the root problem in all of this in British politics? This sense of general malaise. Is it a general issue of the entire frame of reference of how we're operating? And if so, what is that? Because I feel too often the critiques we see and even the arguments in defense of things we see are very technical and very much about the letter of something. But what do you see as the fundamental problem with the UK?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot in what Doug has just said, but just to pick up on something that you've just said, I mean, I think there is something about the letter of law versus the spirit of the law within British culture, and I think Britain sort of prides itself on being a legal culture, a legalistic culture, a place where the law is taken seriously. We always saw this back in the EU days, where we would apply the latest directive word for word, whereas other European countries would sort of put it in their statute books and then broadly ignore it. And you see this in things like the small boats crisis again, where the Home Office, various people sort of say, well, they need their 40 euros a week or 40 quid a week and so on. And there's just a sense that throughout British culture, increasingly there is this kind of Gordian knot of the kind that Doug was talking about, where law upon law upon law has accreted, and at this point, even tort law, things like lawsuits, liabilities. Peter Hitchens has quite a lot of riffs around that subject and how the sort of late 80s legal reforms. I think it was John Major in 1995 who passed one of the great ambulance chasing bills or statutes. Have led to this place of like total systemic inertia and exhaustion. And really what's required somewhere in there is an act of imagination. It's someone to step outside of the frame, to come up a level and enact an act of sheer violence upon the system to slash that Gordian knot. When they were talking about banning smoking on pubs recently, so one particular wag on Twitter suggested that the next Tory government should, or the next government, as it were, or the next government that is of the right or sort of wants to actually change the system, should allow for smoking in pubs, should completely end that sort of the arc of history bends one way sense within British law and British culture, because it has just left us frozen and paralysed. And it wouldn't really be about smoking or otherwise, it would be about an act of creative imagination.
And I suppose that would be a symbolic act to demonstrate the saying that the underlying spirit of this.
Yeah, the world can be made anew.
Can be made anew.
I'd agree. I mean, I think that I've written a bit about this, but there is this deep within the British spirit. There is this duality. On the one hand, you have that buccaneering, pioneering, that don't tread on me freedom thing. Yeah, I mean, you sort of see it through it, the rights of ordinary people and that sense of freedom. But on the other hand, you have very much that obeying of the rules and curtain twitching, and you can't do that here. And that kind of, so there is this weird duality in the British spirit, and I think that I think Thatcherism, independently of the political economy of it and the politics of it, did speak to something quite deep in the British spirit, and it was about rebooting freedom, and that had a legacy that lasted beyond that. But I think the COVID and the lockdowns really rebooted back to that statist. You can't do that, or until tell the authorities on you, and that moralising, which then becomes encoded in this kind of bureaucratic layering. And I think if one thing that the British economy really, people go about growth all the time, growth, grow it. The one thing that really has to happen is we need to deregulate large parts of the economy. You say that and they go, oh, you want to import like GM foods and throw children up the chimneys. No, you're not talking about that. If people realised the amount of regulatory crud that sits on small businesses, SMEs are 2/3 of the British economy. These are people, men and women, that are going out, taking risks, putting their mortgages on the line, their livelihoods on the line, right? And they are swimming through layers and layers and layers of crud that multinational corporations love, because it essentially creates breakout costs for any small upstart and disruptor. It's insane. I mean, so I think we need a sort of to deregulate. And obviously the bureaucracy, the state loves this stuff. You have the growth of bureaucracies all the time. They're growing. What does a bureaucracy do? Because, and the reason, so the administrative state, the technocratic class, they're not subject to the normal error correction mechanisms that you'd see in, say, for example, a market mechanism. If you don't do something well, the aggregated price signaling of people's desires and wishes will come to you, and you'll go out of business. and then you have to restart or rethink your product. You don't get that in big systemic bureaucracies. You get inertia, you get capture, and in fact disruption and creativity and innovation are massive threats to those things. So I think if one thing the British economy really needs, it needs to almost get the state out of people's way and to sort of just deregulate so much of human life is governed by endless regulations. A very close friend of mine is an architect, right? She runs her own architectural business. She's a one-woman architect show, right? Just to put a driveway into a home somewhere, the amount of bureaucratic form filling and bat surveys and newt surveys, to the extent like you had Boris Johnson, this great buccaneering conservative. He wrote a piece for the Daily Mail a couple of years ago where he's celebrating the fact he couldn't put a swimming pool into his home because newts were there. So we're prioritising newts and bats. So houses aren't being built because you need bat surveys, or there's a newt there, or you need an archaeologist to watch every single spade that goes into the ground in case there's a coin found somewhere. People don't realise this, and it's killing things. It's killing things. So I think we need a sort of massive process of de-bureaucratisation and deregulation, not to put kids up chimneys or anything like that, but it's just gone so far. It's strangling the economy.
I have noticed, first of all, I mean, your observation about this tension between, what I've noticed is in Britain, and I'm British, but I only moved there really at age 14 properly. I've always noticed in Britain, there is culturally an unusual awareness, like a reflexive awareness saying we do things this way. Maybe we could do it a different way. It's quite a creative impulse to examine a problem and say, is this the best way of solving it? But at the same time, as you say, there's a competing impulse to codify whatever you come up with.
And then somebody's going to arrive there with a clipboard and say, you can't do that, or you can't cut that tree down, or you can't put that there, or you can't do that. Or if you do that, you've got to fill out this form here, and then it has to go into a bureaucratic doom loop, which sits there for months and months and months, or sometimes years on end. So it's like, well, how then do you advance? The university system is exactly the same. The level of bureaucratic bullshit now in the university system is insane. To the extent now, most academics with half a brain won't do lots of things because the bureaucratic snakes and ladders doom loop game of it is so costly. You just don't do it. So innovation and disruption, they're to be feared. That anyway.
Yeah, and you sort of end up with this game where there's a real game and a parallel game of sort of signs and signals that people are playing around their work. Yeah, I would say that there's something about the media economy of Britain, or the political economy of media in Britain, where these schemes are often ginned up through, I don't know, a press release from some NGO, and suddenly you've got, Martin's Law that came out of the Manchester bombings, whereby now, rather than, I think the story was that someone saw a man with a backpack, and rather than racially profile him and inform the authorities, just didn't do that. The place blew up, and the Martin's Law basically now impedes on small venues, so church halls all have to have security protocols in place, etc. There was the girl who had an anaphylactic reaction to a baguette in Pret-a-Manger, and that enacts a whole world of kind of labelling, etc., etc. And all these stories kind of get ginned up on the Today programme or maybe the Daily Mail. But there is this whole culture of something must be doneism, of that every problem needs a solution. Not every problem needs a solution.
And interestingly, because you have make work, so bureaucrats want this stuff, right? They want it because then they become the compliance regime. Then they become the ones with the clipboard. So then they've got jobs, they've got work, and any bureaucracy will always have a self-interest in simply growing its own power and its own bureaucracy. And this is what we've got. We've got now the growing power of the state, the growing power of the technocratic class, which is throwing endless layers of bullshit across British cultural life, and the economy is strangling it.
It's quite interesting because famously the Americans are quick to sue someone. Their first thing they turn to. Someone says, all right, I'll sue you about that. But it seems in the UK, we don't really have a tendency to sue, but we do have a tendency to email our MP and say, create a law just to make sure this never happens again, whatever it may be. And it seems like we're always trying to legislate against life. And it just, life has the vicissitudes of fortune. It's risky.
Because I think that it also characterises a feature that again spans the Conservatives and the Labour Party, and it is this kind of endless politics of vulnerability. I've spoken about this before. Essentially, as you say, so Jemima goes to Pret-a-Manger, she's got a nut allergy, she swallows a nut and her throat swells up and she, God forbid she dies or something bad happens to Jemima, bring out a new law, I don't know my name, it's Jemima. It is what it is, right? Now, it's a tragic story. That's a tragic story. But why then do we need these laws? Where's the personal responsibility? If I tell you, I've got children, right? If my kid had a nut allergy, there's no way I'd ever take it to any place. Because you're relying upon basically every single human being in that complex chain of events to always get it right vis-a-vis nuts. There's no way I would do that. So where's the personal responsibility? And then the concept of opportunity costs. If Pret-a-Manger or church or, Edna, who's a 75-year-old doing the church hall, every year she used to do the bingo and bring all the pensioners together and have a wonderful social time at Christmas. And nowadays, Edna's not got to spend a couple of weeks filling out a risk assessment form, a fire protection form. She's got to do various security checks, criminal background checks. Edna's not going to do that anymore. So it's a massive social and cultural opportunity cost that's been lost. Those OAPs aren't going to come together anymore for that bingo. Forget about it. So do you see what I mean? It's just this endless bureaucratization done under a politics of vulnerability. We've got to sort of throw the layers of the state across British institutional life and across the economy, because somebody somewhere is going to get hurt unless we do it, and it's a terrible thing. And then it's going to be on you, and you're a bad guy. You're a demon because you've allowed it to happen. You're resisting this process. It's a very strong nature of particularly progressive politics. And I go back to the Conservative Party. They've got to become strategically cognizant of that. Essentially, they have to reboot freedom. We have to return the British economy back to freedom, because that's what's going to grow the economy. That's what's going to put taxes in state coffers. That's what's ultimately going to lift people up. If the state has more money, it can spend on real things as opposed to sustaining endless bureaucracies. The National Health Service is a classic example of this. They go on about the Tories all the time. No one privatise it. The amount of money the National Health Service swallows, in year-on-year growth of funds go to the National Health Service, it's completely broken. What's the error correction mechanism within it? It's not a critique of the wonderful individuals working in it, but it's a critique of the system itself. What's the error correction mechanism in any large public sector bureaucracy?
There's a sort of a point that comes out of this, I think, is that the international order we live in today since World War II is largely, it seems to me, forged in the image and using the structures of the Anglosphere for obvious historical reasons. And I'm wondering, first of all the things we've been talking about, you mentioned that they're progressive leftist ideas. I'm wondering to what extent they're actually a product of a type of Protestant culture, perhaps, or Anglo culture in general. But in either case, would you agree with the idea that it has informed the international system? Because I do feel, if you look at the UN, I went to COP28 in Dubai back in December. It's really interesting when you see just the stultifying bureaucratic non-speak, the jargon of the way they operate. There's this sort of thin gossamer language of technocratic, sort of the thin air of technocratic language, And this is the way they were talking, and they just sound like any other sort of British institution in a sense. So I'm wondering, do you think there's a general malaise internationally in the international order that's slightly a product of what we've been talking about?
Well, I think, yeah. If we want to be brutal and just boil it right down, you essentially have a massive bureaucratic class, both domestically and internationally, which enjoys incredible largesse from taxpayers internationally, British, French, German, American, who essentially are there to develop regulatory and compliance and legalistic frameworks that control your life. And go back, if you look at it as a system level thing, what it's strangling life, to the extent that powerful states, G7 states like the UK, can't solve a fundamental issue like the small boats. This is an issue that's bedeviling British politics. It's endless going on about small boats, and you can't solve it because you've got this legacy architecture, and it's how the nation state interacts with these forms of supranational governance. It's these endless layers of regulatory governance.
Absolutely, yeah. And you talk about the Anglo thing, I guess, to get back to that point, that there's a word that we haven't actually used yet here, which is the L word, liberalism. The international order is a liberal order, and the central logic of liberalism is totalizing. It is the idea that humanity is fungible and that it can be coded. And I guess, prior to the end of the Cold War, there was more of a sense that liberalism was in its box. It was slightly more the liberalism of John Stuart Mill. It was toleration. And now we have hyperliberalism, perhaps, liberalism as progressivism, as an idea that these sort of COP-style organizations can create harmony between vastly different civilizations, between vastly different worldviews, and that we can kind of build this kind of lattice, this kind of blockchain of globalism. And once you get into that, you're on a hiding to nothing, and you just end up in this kind of word soup world where nothing actually gets done because the systemic logic of liberalism and codification has taken over from the underlying realities.
I suppose when we start talking about these sorts of issues, it leads quite naturally into talking about multipolarity, because you've had this sort of system we've been describing, which is wrought in the image of, say, the Anglosphere, Atlantic West. It's been presumed to be, internally, it's been presumed to be the one true way of living, that it should codify human life. And I think even 15 years ago, most people either believed it, or if they disagreed with it, found it hard to actually make the argument. It was such a totalizing frame of reference. But now more and more people are popping up with interesting articulations, not only of why it's failing, but also giving evidence for that. And in the context of that, you're seeing alternative modes of organizing things arise, China and so on. We're doing this podcast right now in Hungary. A couple of weeks ago, Doug, you were here for a conference on geopolitics, and you talked about shallow multipolarity. And I'm wondering if you could just talk about that for a minute, the multipolar world, and the different alternative models arising. What do you see actually happening?
Well, so the concept of shallow multipolarity is developing it for a piece that I think is going to come out soon in the Hungarian Conservative. And so we're in Hungary right now. So Hungary has this connectivity strategy, and I think it's a very interesting, very ambitious idea that seeks to map a grand strategy for smaller states, and how smaller states, often at the edges of or pivot states that are kind of straddled different civilizations. So Russia, in the West, or Turkey would be a great example. The East and the West and all that, and that kind of thing. So essentially, connectivity is a concept that talks about the way in which a small state like Hungary can interrelate on a political, economic, but also a sort of political level with multiple states, and not just align with one bloc. It wants to avoid blocks and economic blocks or protectionist blocks. It wants to be kind of nimble, if you will, not a million miles from the impulse of Brexit, I think, in some ways. So in that piece, one of the meta framework, I guess, for the connectivity strategy in Hungary is a vision, is a picture of the international system that is no longer a unipolar American system, but is actually now much more multipolar. And in particular, it kind of flags the value of China as a kind of counterweight, if you will, to the West, or to the kind of, so connectivity critiques neoliberalism, the Washington Consensus, and globalization, which it sees as antithetical to national culture, to sovereignty, and that kind of thing. So it essentially says that China is a potential alternative pole around which states could organize their foreign relations in a more multipolar international system. So I don't necessarily disagree with most of that, but so I developed the concept of shallow multipolarity. So my position on China, whilst I think its emergence and is an incredible story, I don't think going forward, I don't think that China will remain, or at least maintain the capacity to act as a kind of counter-hegemonic state or weight to the West or to at least America's leadership. And various reasons for that. I think, obviously, and you see similar dynamics in Europe. Demographically, China is on a really bad decline. If you look at the age distribution going forward, essentially you're going to have loads and loads of very old Chinese people sustained by an ever smaller base of Chinese workers. So it's on a demographic slide. By 2050, I think some people say it goes from 1.4 billion to about 700 million people. So it's a very, very significant decline. And if you think about China's rise, its main claim to fame in terms of its economic dominance has been in terms of manufacturing. It does some high-tech stuff, but not particularly well. So it does lots of manufacturing. So if manufacturing is really its major claim to fame, and it's got less and less workers to manufacture things, then one would see the emergence of other centres of manufacturing power and non-Sino-centric manufacturing centres of power, which is what we're now seeing. So other East Asian states like Vietnam or Mexico, etc., becoming very strong. Third element of that shallow multipolarity is the ongoing power of the Americans. And this isn't a celebratory point on my but if you look at the hard data, the American economy remains extraordinarily very, very, very strong. Most of all the cutting-edge aspects of modern capitalism are emergent from the American multinationals, Facebook, Meta, Apple, you name it, and then it maintains itself as a major center for the world's exports. So most of the world, 25% I think, still goes to America. And therefore, even states that don't like America are very incentivized in the health of the American economy. The international reserve currency status of the dollar is still extraordinarily strong. There's been some diversification, but the renminbi could never potentially become, and if we look at the actual foreign exchange holdings, it's about 2%. And because essentially the capacity for any currency to become an international reserve currency is actually far more political than it is in terms of its monetary capacity. Essentially, to become an international reserve currency, investors or holders of your debt have to be confident in the political longevity of your regime. And Xi Jinping has really heavily centralized power, and there's been lots of debt bubbles and stuff like that. I think you saw a stimulus package about 10 days ago, and if you look at today's data, it's already going south in terms of its capacity to stimulate the Chinese economy. And this isn't a celebration of that, by the way. It's just a bit, if you look at a lot of the hard data on China. So my point in terms of the connectivity strategy and shallow multipolarity is to the extent to which China is a counter-hegemonic pole around which you could potentially organise connectivity. It's just a note of caution that as the connectivity strategy develops, you have to have high-level strategic analysis going into it all the time. There's always going to be sort of on the ball in terms of the deeper structures and deeper changes in the global political economy and world order and what that may mean for geopolitics.
Gavin, you were involved in a podcast called Multipolarity, so I wonder if you agree.
I should note that I am the producer of that podcast, so essentially I get other people's ideas piped into me every week. I'm not an expert in this field, but I mean, there's an awful lot in what Doug has just said. So much that, but I guess the Multipolarity, the podcast line, is far more bullish on China and far more bearish on America's capacity to hold its dwindling empire together. And both of those factors are contingent because they're contingent upon political leadership somewhere in all of that. And what we're seeing out of America lately is incredibly weak political leadership. It feels like an end of empire moment, like the center cannot hold. And equally, China seems to be robust. I guess the other point that Multipolarity, the podcast, regularly makes is that China is a manufacturing superpower. And manufacturing is not about one factory here, one factory there. It's about the whole conga line. And China has built that conquer line over 20 or 30, or in some cases even 40 years, and now controls many of the key industries that the West relies on to keep life in the West as going. And as we found out during COVID, and as we're finding out during the Ukraine war, stuff counts. Stuff really counts. A few what ifs about the situation in Taiwan and whether America can kind of hold itself together to the extent that it can defend the Taiwan Strait, and we might be in a very different world where you talk about Vietnam, etc., becoming manufacturing superpowers. Well, not if they're completely in the orbit of China when they hold the first island chain. So, there are a lot of what ifs here. And I guess the other one is whether the Chinese model, as it has been explained to me, is better, more robust at working through any snags that it hits. Right now, China's got quite a lot of infrastructure. It's at that America 1920 point. And it can, obviously in the 1930s, America hit certain points of inflection, the Great Depression, and had to rethink its strategy. But in China, the sort of FDR New Deal outlook is kind of built into the system. It's a command economy, ultimately, and they're much better at riding through those rapids than perhaps America was. I don't know, there's a lot there, but yeah.
Yeah, I just had while you were both talking, you reminded me of a quote, and I just looked it up on I had it somewhere on my computer, and it's a quote from the autumn of 1940 by Edward R. Murrow speaking to a CBS radio audience, and he was speaking in a report from London to America, and he said, "You must understand that the world is dying, that old values, the old prejudices, and the old bases of power and prestige are going." And I think about this quote fairly regularly because it seems to be, at the moment, we're going through something interestingly equivalent in some ways. I was talking yesterday with a friend, and I noted that it was interesting. World War II began in October 1939, ran to April 1945. It was interesting. The pandemic started and it really kicked off October, November 2019. And then, we're going into 2025. We've had a very interesting 5 years of flux. Wars have broken out. It's not a world war, but some people say it is World War III, but happening in a slightly staggered way. But I'm thinking that there's not much we have in society at a sort of institutional, structural level that pre-existed 1945. Most of it was built in the wake of that war. And so someone in 1930, imagining what will the world look like in 30 years, 20 years, 100 years, wouldn't have had much of a frame of reference to look at that. And I'm wondering, we started talking about how the orthodoxies of the West, shared by both parties in whatever country, this kind of a technocratic neoliberal consensus, which has sort of run its course. And then we thought, well, what about the alternatives? And there's China, and you're saying China is also not doing particularly well. And so I'm wondering, to what extent can we even talk about what the future is going to be? To what extent will the new frame of reference be so alien to us, entirely different in 3, 4, 5 years, that we're simply in no position to even know? Is it possible for us to think outside of the frame of reference that we've been living with the last few decades? It's quite an existential question, but where do you see things going? I should add on that. I mean, we've got these wars going on right now in the Middle East. Obviously, Ukraine. There's more tensions brewing. We can, I think, feel in the world. Maybe Taiwan at some point. So, what do you think of our ability to even forecast what's going to be happening?
Yeah, well, it's terrible. I mean, our ability to forecast anything is just appalling. I guess the bigger question is, I look to the hills from whence my salvation comes, and what is the thing that's going to bring that new world? And often it is a big existential crisis. How do we get outside of the boomer world that we've built? And as you said at the start, perhaps it's something to do with the end of an era. Perhaps it is to do with a kind of the great Zoomer reset. It's just very hard to say.
I mean, this is like a big mystic Meg moment, right? But I am naturally quite optimistic about things in general. And I think if we look at where we are as humanity now, look at a lot of the hard data, we're in a very, very good place. Look at global poverty, the capacity for technological innovation to leapfrog societies in radical ways. So child mortality, education, not just in the West, but globally. And China's been a massive part of that story. I mean, look, China in the mid-'60s had a lower GDP per capita than sub-Saharan Africa. Today, look at China, it's an incredible story, incredible rise. Wonderful, lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So I think that we're most probably, and it feels, this is where I go slightly off the reservation, right? So I put my Mystic Meg hat on, and we can go around on the Ukraine thing, because obviously there are various. You talk about the World War, right? I think the Ukraine thing has been an absolute tragedy. I think that whoever wins, I think whoever wins in the US, that will obviously decide it. This got to be settled. I suspect that any peace settlement will look not a million miles away from the 2022 peace settlement that was on the table already. And so I think that will be settled. It's in everybody's interest to be settled. On Russia and that, I think the Ukraine war is as much about status as it is about national security. If not, it's more about status for the Russian foreign policy elite and Putin. He sees the world in very much historical terms. He sees Russia as a great power. He sees the end of the Cold War as a tragedy, not just in terms of the loss of the Soviet, but the loss of Russia's great power status. And I think there is this kind of, not a million miles from the kind of narrative that you saw on Versailles in Germany, which is kind of the end of the Cold War, saw Russia stabbed in the back. It was betrayed by the West, and you saw the expansion of NATO. And so there is this historical sense to Putin and the people around him. So if we see in those terms that Russia's invasion and war in Ukraine, as horrible and as horrific as it is as much about status and Russia's the Putin foreign policy feeling that Russia's status is out of whack with the respect it deserves, then that is potentially solvable in relation to a potential reset or a new grand bargain. I've said this before. With kind of post-Putin Russia or Russia, so you have the legacy security architecture of NATO, which is always about containing the Soviet Union, and you would think that given the magnitude of what's going on in Europe, and Europe can never settle if Russia is stirring things up. It maintains nuclear weapons. It always has that capacity. So it's in Europe's massive collective interest to try and reset and reboot relationships with Russia. I know it sounds crazy saying this right now, the Ukraine crisis going on, but some kind of new Yalta conference which potentially sort of reboots the NATO framework into a post-NATO framework that would reincorporate Russia into a post-NATO security architecture done in a way that's respectful of everybody. I know that sounds, but that you think about where we were in 1942 vis-a-vis Japan and Germany. And people will say, well, yeah, but you have to massively defeat Russia to make them get on their knees to accept this thing. Not necessarily. If we accept the status thing. On China and Taiwan, I know this is a bubbling thing. I think that China is in a really sort of very, very different geopolitical space to somewhere like the US. If you think about China's strategic conundrums, it's not just about maritime security. About 90% of China's economy relies upon sea trade, and that's still underwritten by the US Navy. It polices the global waterways and solves the collective action problems that all great economies have in relation to the necessity to have open seas. So China has lots of maritime and naval conundrums, and it also has massive land borders with various states that hate it or have had wars with it. That includes Russia, India, etc. So it has a large domestic population, many of whom aren't that happy. And if the wheels start coming off the Chinese economy, that unhappiness is going to grow. Post Tiananmen, the deal of the CCP was, we'll make you rich, but don't try and rock the boat anymore. And that was the deal. And if the wheels come off that deal, and you look at FDI, the FDI in China now is down 83% in 2023. Huge drop-off of FDI. It's been cut out of lots of manufacturing networks. Still very, very important, but increasingly, and you'll see increased protectionism. You're already seeing it. Trump did it, Biden did it, and whoever gets in next will do it from chips, high-level technological infrastructure, etc. Taking Taiwan will be very, very hard for China. It will be very costly. That itself will have its own kind of political effects in China itself. And even if they get Taiwan, okay, they've reunified the motherland. They've had that massive status and that nationalist boost. But then what have they got? I mean, yes, they have the kind of island chain, but they have problems with their navy. They don't have particularly capable naval nuclear submarines. One just sunk recently. Do you see what I mean? And then they're surrounded. So Vietnam, Japan, Vietnam and China have had 7 wars in the last couple 100 years. Most of which I think China have lost. Japan has got the second best navy in the world, and if China really starts to stir things up, Japan will go nuclear overnight. And it will beef its security up big time. So there'll be like a sort of containment of China, if you will. So even that is a big one. And then obviously the big one now obviously is Israel and what's going on in the Middle East. We could talk about that if you wanted to. But so in terms of this kind of this counter-hegemonic axis, and this isn't me saying America rah rah rah. I'm kind of indifferent to it, really. I mean, I think that American power internationally is still infinitely preferable to what else is on the table. But
well, on this actually, I mean, one way to sort of talk about these conflicts going on in the context of the States, obviously the US elections coming up in a couple of weeks' time. Yeah. Assuming, we know what the situation will be, I think, if the current administration stays in power, at least with the vice president. Mm-hmm. But what do you think the change, what would you see as the fundamental change in American strategy and policy if Trump won?
Should I go first or you?
Sure. I mean, I think it'd be... well, I mean, it depends on what happens with Ukraine. Just to pick up on what Doug was saying about I love that idea of the grand bargain and starting again with a new Yalta and maybe even a new Bretton Woods. And I'd say that,
Well, I just interrupt. Actually, when you said that, I did have the thought that what you're actually suggesting is simply an entirely new system of international institutions.
So just briefly, the international institutional architecture we have globally is a legacy of the post-war system and American power. And I think it does need to change radically to reflect some of the tensions that we've identified in this podcast. The democratic social contract, the relationship of these international institutions to sovereignty, to how popular opinion is respected and taken seriously, and to also the rise of non-Western powers, and sort of I hate to use the term, but to have a more inclusive international system. And I think that's very, very important.
Well, just sorry, Gavin, just to interrupt again for a second. I asked earlier when I said, what's the solution? Then I reframed it. I said, well, what's actually the problem? But I keep having this question is, what is the fundamental problem when we look at international affairs? Clearly there is one. But I mean, it seems to be that if you look at the 20th century had these two sides, communism, capitalism. Now, they had very different ideologies, but they kind of agreed on the problem. They agreed that the best way to... And the solution, but they assumed, they both agreed the problem of life, or the problems of life, are best understood through a political economic framing, and the best solution were political economic solutions. It could be the market or the state, but still political economic solutions. When I look around now, I think one of the problems we have within our societies in this so-called culture war, and also internationally, between different blocks, is that no one really agrees on what the problem is. And unless you can agree on the problem, then it's unclear how to agree on what institutions you need to come to compromises to foreclose on the possibility of global conflict, which is the point of these international arrangements. What do you see as then the problem that we need to identify fundamentally, not just the details, but in a sense, back to the idea of the letter and the spirit? What is the spirit of the world's problem, that we're trying to solve with these institutes? Because until people identify that, I don't see how we can come up with a framework that will have much utility.
I mean, well, that is a spiritual problem about the spirit of man, and perhaps probably beyond this. And I think one of the problems is that we simply have to accept that man is always in flux and will want contradictory things as a sort of a Jungian being at that level. And disorder is part of.
But something in it, you're saying having institutions accept the world as it is, not just always working from what one person thinks it ought to be, which seems to be the conflict. You have these very conflicting, mutually exclusive, uncompromising positions.
Well, you do. I mean, you have a rising hegemon and a declining hegemon, and you have those tensions kind of shaking out. And obviously, the band was going well for maybe 10, maybe 20 years, but not so much anymore. But all these ructions will kind of constantly arise throughout history. History doesn't end. But what I would say about the present order. Is that it's the post 1945 order. We got UN, we got Bretton Woods, etc. out of that redrawing of the map of Europe, and that whole order was designed to prevent a land war in Europe. That was the sort of the central point of it. And in February of 2022, maybe a bit before that, Vladimir Putin broke the sacred taboo of Western modernity. And at that moment, history really re-began, because now everything is in flux, everything is in play. We have the hungry hippos of great empires doing great empire stuff, as they have always done. I think there is something to be said for a world of some, absolute memory hole pivot, where suddenly, in a post-Putin world or something like that, we break up the proverbial one thing we never wanted to happen of Russia and China now forming this kind of hegemonic unit, and bring Russia back into the fold.
I think that is the key thing, and I've written about this too, and that is if you manage to do that, where you have the reboot, because I think in many ways, part of the big problem that we have internationally is the legacy institutions that arose under American hegemony in the post-war international system, in the context of bipolarity, carried on in the post-Cold War period, and that also coincided with unipolarity. So America could pretty much do what it wanted to do, and I think there were some mistakes in that. I think one of the big mistakes in relation to European security was the non-reformation of the NATO framework to incorporate Russia in some way. And I think that was a lost opportunity. And I think many of the legacies that we see and that now reflect the loss of that opportunity from what Russia concluded vis-a-vis Clinton's intervention in Bosnia, the Kosovo campaign, and so on and so forth. Now, no matter where you stand on Russia and its aggression and its brutality and what you stand on it, the fact is Russia does exist. It exists. It's not going to go away, and it has nuclear weapons, and obviously it's nowhere near as militarily powerful as we thought it was, but nonetheless it's still there. And is it going to wrap things up in Ukraine and then go for NATO countries? Of course it's not. Absolutely no way would it do that. It'd get absolutely decimated and destroyed. Look the amount, the meat grinder it's having to go through in Ukraine, and Ukraine nowhere near the amount of military personnel, having to literally sellotape drones together. I mean, they're doing a very incredible job there. Let alone going against a country or the NATO alliance. So Russia would not do that, but that doesn't mean that Russia shouldn't be afforded respect. And if we go back to my point about status, to recognise that, to recognise Russia's greatness in terms of its contribution to world civilization, literature, and history, isn't that costly on the West? And if you do that and you manage to reset, you look at Putin, whenever he's on the world stage prior to Ukraine, he's beaming, he's happy, he feels, do you see what I mean? So you have to have that emotional and deeper, almost spiritual analysis of what drives leadership. And I think that's a big part of the story. And I don't think it's a million miles away from Xi Jinping. I mean, I'm not a China specialist, I'm going way out on a limb here. But obviously the Taiwan thing is deeply ingrained in Chinese nationalism. They feel, obviously, the loss of great power status as a result of British imperialism, and that left a historical legacy. They're rising up now. They're a millennia-old civilization, and Taiwan is a thorn in their side in relation to that. It pricks the soul of the Chinese, national feeling. So again, if you go back to that, I think that's a. I guess what I'm saying is, what I would love to see is a degree of greater leadership especially on the West, for dialogue, where you could have potentially these reboot conferences, Yalta, literally the distribution of spoils of the entirety of Europe. Right? Why not have something similar now, where there are these international conflicts? Many of them are very complicated. They're about national security, but they're also about civilizational purpose, the sense of will, a spiritual journey, the sense of nationalism, the sense of status. A lot of it floats in that, and a lot of diplomacy. Whenever you lead things, you realize a lot of it is about emotion.
I wonder on this that we have to wrap things up now, but one theme I've found running through this is we started with this critique of the technocratic mind and the letter and the spirit and so on. And it does seem that if you look at within the UK, for instance, things like Brexit, it never seemed to be understood by a lot of people with a technocratic sensibility, sort of Whiggish sensibility in some ways, because it was something that wasn't about the letter, it was about the spirit of something. And then if you look at the people don't understand, I suppose, not to praise or condemn, but people don't really understand, I think, Russia's frame of reference or even the Chinese frames of reference. And I wonder if what we're talking about, and I said before about the problem, maybe it's that there's half the world see the world in a very sort of literal, sort of almost legalistic, sort of lettered way. And then actually there is the rest of life, which has got this sort of slightly intangible, analog rather than digital sort of spirit to it. Perhaps we've just got to break down a communication between these two frames of reference. Perhaps that's the one pattern I see.
I think so, and I think also, I know we've got to wrap up soon, but I think that going back to your original point about the different administrations, I think the big tension there in American foreign policy is between the sort of the more liberal internationalist wing, which has inflections to it, the neocon bit, the liberal hegemony, but the liberal internationalist wing, which is about cannibalizing also, capitalizing on the legacy frameworks that we see post-war. But it also has a normative element too, an imposition normative element, which I think many people rankle against. I know in Hungary there's a very strong rankling against the imposition of America's domestic norms. So there is that versus the more kind of Trumpian protectionist, but also a critique of globalization and the costs of America's liberal internationalism. So I think to really cut through this, one of the biggest dynamics in America's foreign security relationships now going forward will be the analysis, the cost-benefit analysis that sits at the heart of American foreign policy making. Trump says the costs of underwriting liberal internationalism, liberal international order are far too big. Essentially, America doesn't get enough bang for its buck out of that. It has to underwrite NATO. These people are taking the mickey. They're free riding. Whereas the Kamala Biden thing is a kind of continuity liberal internationalism, which wants to continue that process. So I think that's the big schism that we'll see playing out. And then that also has domestic implications, right? Globalization on one side, but look at the cost of the American working class, the post-industrialism, the outsourcing of jobs, etc., open borders, immigration, versus that kind of liberal internationalist framework. So I think that's the big schism we'll see, sovereignty versus supranationalism and internationalism.
If I can just throw something in here on this, it's I don't know if this is a good framing, but it's interesting when you look at the sort of liberal institutional powers. They often speak softly or quite humbly, but let me finish my statement. No, is that the language, the framing is often about empathy and humility and so on. But actually, it's humble words within a hubristic framework. We've listened to Trump. Trump is quite hubristic in how he speaks, but it's in service, it seems, of quite a humble framework of saying actually live and let live to some extent, and this sort of more isolationist view. And I wonder if there's something in that, just this, because the whole order seems to be built around a lot of the established order has, even if the underlying idea is that one ought to be humble about one's place in relation to others and treat people with kindness and so on. There's a kind of hubris of imposing this on everyone. You see what I mean? Whereas, again, Trump speaks quite loudly, but actually, I mean, he was one of the only presidents who didn't oversee any international wars. So, okay, any final comments? And then we should wrap it up, I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Trump is a political storyteller, and he's telling new narratives. And in order to tell those narratives, he needs to shout quite loudly. And, in that sense, maybe to kind of wrap things up, what we need are new stories. In 1941, we were told that the Soviet Union was the great enemy, and then in 1942, it was cuddly Uncle Joe. And these narratives can pivot on a dime. I'd say something like the Kamala regime is continuity. That is Tina. There is no alternative world, and it is the world of legalism. And be it the Gordian knot of British society or Trumpism 2.0 or a new grand bargain, we need new stories.
Well, Doug, Gavin, thank you very much for joining us today on the Danube Institute podcast.
Thank you very much.